a lot of it, many of us have been looking forward to this presentation. Jim Squires actually came across Cole's work in live, it was Chicago Live, Jim?
Close enough, out of Chicago Live.
Okay. And so I want to tell you a little bit about Cole, and this is from his bio that he sent me today. Cole Thompson is uniquely unqualified to speak on photography. I've never taken a photography class or a workshop. I don't have a degree in art. I've never worked as a photographer. I don't have gallery representation. I'm not a Canon explorer of light, and I only have 3 lenses and none of them are primes. Do I have any qualifications? Just one, my images. Nothing else matters. And I think that's very well said. And with that, Cole, I'll let you take over.
Okay, thanks, Jenny. Jim, thanks for inviting me. Thanks all of you for your time. I'm just going to launch right in, so let me share my screen. Well, my presentation is called Why Black and White? But while it is about black and white, it really is about something much greater than black and white. But I'm not going to tell you what it is. I'm going to make you figure it out. It won't be hard. So, to understand black and white, we first must examine the history of black and white. We need to undertake a comparative and historical analysis with an emphasis on the relative intrinsic value of the inherent intermodal causeways of the medium when compared to other artistic disciplines. Now, you all understood that, right? Because I didn't. Unfortunately for you, this part of the program is incredibly boring and long. So let's just get right into it. In the beginning, all art was created in black and white. But then color was invented and the world turned colorful. But then photography was invented and it turned back to black and white. But then Kodacolor was invented and it turned back to color. The end. That's about all we really need to know about the history of black and white. Now, how many of you would buy a 3-legged dog? Or get on an airplane with only 1 wing? Or buy a car with no wheels? So why then would I take a perfectly good color image and strip it of all color? Why? It would be like owning a Model T in a Tesla world, or like using wet plate photography in a digital world. It would be like owning a 3-legged dog. It would be somehow incomplete. I'd like to talk about my journey to black and white and maybe why you might consider it. Not a daytime, that's not a nighttime shot, that's a daytime shot. My story begins in 1968 in Rochester, New York. I was a 14-year-old boy and I was out for a hike one day and I came across this old ruined home. And my friend told me it had once been owned by George Eastman. And that piqued my interest. So I went to the school library, checked out his biography, and began reading about photography. And before I had finished that book, and before I'd ever taken a picture or been in a darkroom to see that magic moment when a print comes up in the developer, I was convinced my destiny was to be a fine art photographer. And for the next 10 years, my entire life was photography. And I mean, literally, every hour of the day was spent either photographing, working in the darkroom, or looking at the images of the great masters. And as I looked at their work, I was always drawn to a very particular type of work. They were black and white images. They were dark images. They were contrasty images. And they were images that when I saw something that I loved, it caused a shudder to go down my spine. And they inspired me. And I wanted to create these types of images. This is my very first fine art image created at the age of 14. But a lot of people ask me, but why black and white? You were born into a color world. And I tell them, no, I wasn't. I was born into a black and white world. When I was a boy, television was all in black and white. Movies were in black and white. The news was delivered in black and white. My childhood heroes were in black and white. And sadly, even our nation was still segregated into black and white. And so I created black and white images. Perhaps they are an extension of the world I grew up in. For me, color records the surface, but black and white reveals the feelings that lie beneath the surface. Or put another way, color is a happy meal, and black and white is fine dining. Now, what do I look for in a great black and white image? Well, I love dark images. And this is my only nighttime shot that I can recall. I love a glowing subject. I love detail, especially when the detail is enhanced by contrast. And I love simple shapes, textures, and patterns. And increasingly, my work is getting more and more simple. I often use a long exposure to simplify my images. And I'll use it with water, with skies, and I'll even use a long exposure with people. This is the Angel Gabriel, and I call this my most significant image because it was the very first time that as I stood there, I could see the final image in my head. I was photographing on the Newport Beach Pier in Southern California, and it's a crowded day. Hundreds of people are walking past me. But because I'm using a long exposure, those people disappear, except for those few ghosts who lingered for just a few seconds. And the image was interesting, but it was lacking something. It was lacking a subject. So I looked around for someone I could ask to stand in my image when I saw this homeless man, and he was reaching into a trash can and he pulled out some French fries and was eating them. And I went up to him and I asked him if he would stand in my image. I'd be happy to take him to lunch. And he was so reluctant. He was really suspicious of me, but he finally agreed. And he wanted to hold his Bible. And this was the image that we used. And I should mention, it turns out that his name was Gabriel. And so that's why I named the image the Angel Gabriel. I took Gabriel to a very nice restaurant, and imagine walking in with a homeless person who is barefoot, who is filthy and matted hair. As we sat and looked at the menu, I said to Gabriel, order anything that you like. And he said, I'd love a steak with mushrooms and onions. And when the waitress brought his meal, he picked it up and ate it with his hands. Gabriel had been a drug addict, but was now clean, but he seemed perhaps a little impaired from that experience. I learned that Gabriel had come from Romania, and I'm half Romanian, so we got to talk about that and my family name. He was a delightful fellow. As we were getting ready to part ways, I learned that Gabriel's father lived nearby. And so I said, Gabriel, give me his name and address. And if I sell any of these images, I'd be happy to share a portion with you. To which he responded, give it to someone who can really use it. I have everything that I need. And Gabriel walked away with his only two possessions, that Bible and his bedroll. I go back to Southern California several times a year. Always go back to the Newport Beach Pier to look for Gabriel, but have not seen him since. So how do you learn to photograph in black and white? Well, here's what I do. First, I put my camera into monochrome mode and raw mode. And is the important word. In monochrome mode, I can see the black and white image on the back of my camera. That's the best way to visualize it. But because I'm in raw mode, it brings the image into Photoshop in color. Now, why would a black and white photographer want to bring its image in color? It's because I want to be the one to control the black and white conversion. This is what it looks like in the upper left when the camera shot it in black and white. In the lower right is what a color image converted by myself looks like. There's quite a difference. So I never want the camera to make those decisions for me. And never photograph in monochrome and JPEG, because then you're going to get a black and white image and you won't be able to convert it yourself. Next, learn how colors translate into shades of gray, because black and white is all about contrast. And more importantly, learn how to manipulate those colors into different shades of gray using the black and white conversion program. Then think in terms of shapes, contrasts, and composition. I think of a black and white image as a naked image. There is no color to hide behind. If you don't have a good composition, you have nothing. Now, what subjects look great in black and white? Well, I actually think they all do, except for one. Unicorns. Those should always be photographed in color. Now, tonight, I'd like to give you a sampling of some of my work. I'd like to show you images from each of my different portfolios, interspersed with some of my photographic philosophies. Now, a portfolio is simply a group of images that are related or tell a story. And for years, I resisted working in portfolios. I called myself a photographic grazer. I just like to go wherever the grass was greener. Well, a few years later, I decided to submit my work to Lenswork. Oh, I should say, even though I was a photographic grazer, I did create some good images, but the problem was they weren't related in any way. They were my greatest hits. Well, a few years later, I decided to submit my work to Lenswork. And the submission guidelines really were very simple. Send 15 to 25 images on a single subject. And then it said, do not send us your greatest hits. Well, I thought to myself, he's never seen my greatest hits. And so off they went. Well, they came back in just a few days with this hand-scrawled note that said, pick one image and send me 15 on that same subject. And that was the kick I needed to begin my very first portfolio or project. Grain silos. I live on the edge of the Great Plains, and everywhere you go, you'll see a grain silo where I live. They're at the center of every small farm, and they're at the heart of every city. They're everywhere. And so for the next 9 months, I just traveled the plains and tried to portray these grain silos not as objects of utility, but rather as objects of art. And the thing I learned from this very first project was, I love projects. Now I hate it when I don't have a project to work on. And I think I never pursued them because I thought they took years and years to complete. And I've got a real short attention span. And what I've learned is they really just take as long as they take. That was my first project to go into Lenswork. Now, I've heard you don't consider yourself a photographer. No, I now think of myself as an artist who uses photography. But for 35 years, I did think of myself as a photographer, and I had a photographer's mentality. As a photographer, I almost worshiped my equipment. To watch me, you'd think it was more important than the images I created. But now as an artist, my God is the image, and my camera is simply a tool. As a photographer, my goal was to document what I saw through my eyes. But now as an artist, my goal is to show you what I'm seeing inside my head through my vision. And there's nothing wrong with documenting or being a photographer, but I wanted to create. Melting giants. A few years ago, I overheard two gentlemen talking about these incredible icebergs that come along the coast of Newfoundland. And so off I went, a 9,000-mile road trip, 1 month to photograph these icebergs. When I got there, I thought this a very sad story. These icebergs live an incredibly short life, 9 to 12 months. They begin their life by breaking off a glacier in Greenland, and then they float along until they come along the coast of Newfoundland. There they break into these smaller pieces, and they run aground and, rocking in the surf, end up dying on shore as these 30,000-year-old ice cubes. So I created the portfolio as a very dark and very high contrast one. This is my favorite iceberg from the series, and he almost didn't make it in, and I'll explain why in a few minutes. Now, despite the darkness of my images, I was actually working under very beautiful conditions. And to give you a sense of scale, that iceberg way off on the horizon on the right, that is probably the size of 4 or 5 aircraft carriers, just enormous. Ansel Adams. When I was a boy, I think every young boy who was into photography almost worshiped Ansel Adams. He really was our photo god. And I tried to imitate his look. And I even would go to Yosemite, try to learn where he stood for his iconic shots and try to recreate them. And there was no greater compliment that I could receive than when someone looked at one of my images and said, "That reminds me of an Ansel Adams." And I'd beam with pride. Well, a few years later, I went to review Santa Fe. That's where you take your work and you show it to different experts in the field, hoping to be discovered. And I got to the last reviewer of the day, and he looked at my work ever so briefly, and then he brusquely pushed it back to me and said, "It looks like you're trying to copy Ansel Adams." And I said proudly, "I am. I love Ansel Adams." And he then said something that would change not just my photography, but my life forever. He said, "Ansel already did Ansel. What can you do that exhibits your unique vision?" Talk about a violent epiphany. It suddenly occurred to me, was it my life's ambition to become known as the world's greatest Ansel Adams imitator? Imagine Ginny introducing me tonight as, tonight's guest is Cole Thompson, and he is the foremost imitator of Ansel Adams' work. Or did I have something to say of my own? And that set me forth on a 2-year journey to find out, did I have a vision? Monoliths. Every September, I go to a small town on the coast of Oregon. It's called Bandon. And what I love about Bandon is it's got a 2-mile stretch of beach with these incredible monoliths that stick straight up out of the sand. First time I saw it, I fell in love with it. And I've been going back every year now for close to 20 years. And every year I see something a little bit differently. The weather's different, the lighting's different. But the most important thing that's different is my vision. So I always come home with something new. So vision, what is it? I'd heard people use the word. I generally understood the context in which it was used, but I didn't really know what it was, and I couldn't explain it. Is it a style that you develop? Is it a look or a technique? Is it a creative talent that you're born with? Is it something that some people have and others don't? And it turns out that it's none of those things. Vision is simply the sum total of our life experiences that allows us to see the world in a unique way. Imagine if you could take everything that you know, everything you've been taught, everything you've experienced, and put that into a blender, and take that mix and cast lenses that you then see the world through. And what you see through those life lenses is your vision. It's just how you see. Vision's not learned or developed. You can't take a course on vision, come out with a certificate, and your vision. But rather, vision has to be discovered. And I use that word discovered purposely because the greatest truth I learned about vision was that we all have one. You can't not have a vision. Why is vision so important? Because it's the difference between an average image and a great image. It's what gives your image a spark of life. It's what puts your mark on your image. What vision is not. Vision is not a look or a style or a technique, an approach. It's not calculated, learned, and you can't plan it and you can't teach it. Vision does not guarantee that others will like your work or that you'll win more contests, become published, or have more sales. But finding and following your vision will bring about a personal satisfaction that's worth more than all the 15 minutes of fame you might get by pleasing other people. Vision is the critical element in a great image, and one that many photographers overlook. Trees from a train. In the 1970s, I lived in Alaska, but sadly, I never went back. Never went back to visit old friends, never took my family there on a vacation, and I always regretted that. Well, October of 19, a friend calls me up and says, I got one of those 2-for-1 ticket deals and I'm headed to Alaska. Would you like to join me? And I jumped at the chance. Didn't know what I would do there, but I did want to take the train ride from Fairbanks to Anchorage. It's a 12-hour ride through some of the most rugged and isolated parts of Alaska. And on that day, we had a nice snowstorm, so I was excited. Well, the first thing I did when getting on a train is grab a window seat, get my camera out, and look for something to shoot. Well, I quickly realized this was going to be a lot tougher than I had imagined. You're basically speeding through a tunnel of trees through the mountains at 50 miles per hour. And with a snowstorm, we had really limited visibility. So I went between 2 cars and I opened up both doors and began shooting outside each side of the car. And really the obvious subject was trees. So I started photographing the trees. Then I started panning with the trees. And then I said to myself, I wonder what would happen if I used a long exposure and I panned with the trees. And the result blew me away. The very first shot, I'm thinking, what is that? This swirl that I couldn't understand. So for the next 12 hours, I played with it, trying to learn how to control that swirl, and just had a blast. It was really a project of passion. And it wasn't until I got home that I fully understood what the swirl was about. It's the combination of all these motions. But the real key was the shutter. Our focal plane shutters, most of us have a little slit that moves from the top to the bottom of the film plane. And that up and down motion combined with the sideways motion created this swirl. And it was amazing. I could sometimes get a 360-degree swirl with the tree standing perfectly still. That image was on a recent cover of Lenswork. So how did I find my vision? Well, I didn't even understand what vision was, so how could I find it? So I did the obvious thing. I Googled it, how to find my vision. And all I got was articles about my eyesight. So I just out of instinct came up with 10 steps, 10 ideas that I thought would help me find out if I had a vision. First thing I did, I printed out all my favorite images, my best, and I divided them into 2 piles. Images that I really, really loved and everything else. Now that might sound like a simple exercise, but for me, it was tough because I found that I really couldn't distinguish between what I loved and what was popular with others. So I had to really, really search my heart and say, what is it I love? And put it into that small pile. Next, I said, what do I love about each of these images? I didn't look for a commonality or anything that tied them together. Just what about each image did I love? And that was a hint about my vision. This was the most useful part of my exercise. Then I committed to never again producing work that I didn't love. If I had been in Bandon, Oregon, and came across the world's greatest sunset, and I hate sunsets or sunrises, but I knew it would sell, it would win and earn likes, I would not pursue it. I call this creating honest work. I had to be true to what I love and not create for others. Next, I practice photographic celibacy. It's a bizarre concept that nobody agrees with. I don't look at the work of other photographers. Why not? Well, because I found myself always imitating their look, their style, their idea. And I reasoned that if I was going to find my vision, I had to stop immersing myself in other people's vision. Next, I had to change my mindset from photographer to artist. That 35 years of being a photographer came with a lot of rigid rules and a lot of do nots, and I had to scrap that. And the hardest of all, I had to stop caring what other people thought of my work. I had to get to a point where if I loved an image and no one else did, that I could be okay with that. And it took me 2 very long, very hard, gut-wrenching years to find my vision. And many times, having felt I made no progress, I wanted to give up. And the problem was I was looking for a very complicated answer about what vision was. And it turns out that it's so incredibly simple. It's just how I see things, how I would like them to be, without the influences of everyone else, with their rules, with their likes, with their opinions. Now, the best way to show what vision looks like is to show you some before and after images. The before image will show you what I saw with my eyes. And the after image, how I was able to create something from my vision. And let's start with the first time it ever happened to me, the Angel Gabriel. As I stood there that day, I could see the final image in my head. I visualized it. And that became so important because it was like a roadmap that told me how to shoot the image and how to process it. And I was brand new to Photoshop, and I didn't have a lot of skills, very few skills, but that doesn't matter. Here's the before and after. I can always learn the skills needed to transform what the eye saw into my vision. That's never a problem. But the vision is the key. This is skeleton, a pile of bones found along the river in my hometown, exactly as they lie. And as I look down on those bones, I remember visualizing these very dark leaves with these bright bones glowing out. But that's not what my eyes saw. I saw bright leaves and bright bones. And so again, the technical's never a problem. I learned the techniques needed, and I converted it to my vision. This is Windmill and Moonlight, that only nighttime shot I've got. The difficulty in this shot was I knew how I wanted it, but I didn't really know how to do it. It was so bright out. We had an almost full moon, freshly fallen snow. And so I simply shot one exposure for the sky, one exposure for the foreground, and then cut and pasted the two halves together in Photoshop. I'll always find a way, even if it's not the most elegant way, but I'll find a way. Now, some people will say, after seeing your before and after images, I realize I need to learn a lot more about Photoshop. And that is exactly not my point. Some people believe you need to have the skills before you can express your vision. And I so disagree with that approach. I believe in finding my vision first, and then I obtain the skills I need to express it. When I created the ghost of Auschwitz-Birkenau, I didn't know how to do this, but I had the vision in my head. I could see it. And as you can see, I really had to work hard to convert that shot into my final vision. This is that favorite iceberg that almost didn't make it into the portfolio. All those images in my portfolio were 30-second or longer exposures. But this one iceberg was rocking so badly, I couldn't do a long exposure. So I just simply took a still and said, I'll find a way to convert that into a long exposure later. And I did. I found a technique in Photoshop that made it look indistinguishable from my other long exposures. This is from my series, Lenny, a portrait with breast cancer. And I had a vision of how I wanted to portray Lenny. Here's the shot, what the eye saw, and the final image. Last one, Lone Man number 20, shot at La Jolla Cove, San Diego. Here's the before and the after. What I see with my eyes is of no importance. What I'm seeing in my head is critical because it directs my images. Now, my post-processing is incredibly simple. I would challenge you to find a simpler post-processing routine. I typically am using 6 tools in Photoshop. Here they are. Now, what I do is I bring my color image into Raw Converter just so I can convert it to a TIFF file. And I tweak those little sliders. I don't really know what I'm doing. I just move them back and forth until I can get that image as close to my final image as I can. Second step is where the magic begins. The black and white conversion tool allows you to move these color sliders and drastically change the look of the image. And that's why I don't want the camera or Photoshop to do it for me. Let me give an example. This image, all 4 of these are the same image. And the only thing I've done is change 2 of the color sliders. Look at the lower right, how dark the sky is. Now look to the left, how bright the sky is. Look at the contrast of the clouds. You can do so much with this one step. And a lot of people just desaturate their image, and they're losing a lot of creative control. Step 3, I adjust my levels to ensure I have a true black and a true white. A lot of people judge by their monitor, and you can't do that. You got to use your histogram. And having a true black and a true white is key to having a good looking print. Step 4 is to dodge and burn. That simply means that I use a pen and a tablet to on a very small level, control parts of the image without affecting the rest of the image. So in this image, I used the burning tool to darken and vignette the sky. I burned in some detail in that frothy white foam, and I burnt down some distracting detail in the foreground. The 5th step is to add contrast. If you've ever printed black and white, you know that whenever you see it on the screen, it looks very contrasty and punchy, but when you print it, it looks a lot flatter. Well, by adding contrast, I can mostly overcome that effect. And the 6th step, I simply remove all the spots because I always have a dirty sensor. Now there's your before and after. Now, Popular Photography called me the Photoshop heretic because they said I do everything wrong. I break every rule. And you know, for the longest time, I was so embarrassed about my post-processing routine, I would never let any of my friends watch me work because they had these incredibly elaborate and complicated and difficult routines. And mine was so very simple. But the truth is, there are no right or wrong ways to use Photoshop. There's only the way that works for you. And I love simple. Now, I'd like to share the secret to post-processing, more important than any of those 6 steps I just talked about. It is knowing what you want to do, not knowing how to do it. Anyone can learn how to do it. When I stand before a scene, I always see the final image in my head, and that becomes a roadmap. Isolated. Isolated is a very simple project about isolation, expressed through trees. Now, this is an open project of mine, meaning I haven't completed it. And I've got 3 or 4 of these open projects. And I love having open projects because it means no matter where I go in the world, I can find another image to slip into that portfolio. I just came home about 2 weeks ago from Guam and added this image to the portfolio. Now, when I was in Newfoundland shooting the icebergs, I heard about this place, a Bay of Fundy. It's got a tide of 55 feet, the highest in the world. And I imagined shooting these Hopewell rocks at high tide. But when I got there, this is what I found. It was low tide. So I had to go down to the bottom of the steps, down to the bay, and I just waited for 10 hours for the water to come up. Finally, when it did, my tripod was partially submerged, and it was so dark that I had to use an 8-minute exposure. Now, just here a couple of weeks ago, the erosion caused the Hopewell rocks to tumble. So I'm glad I got a shot before they were gone forever. So when you go to a new location, how do you prepare? I don't. When I go to a new location, I do 2 things. I book a flight and I rent a car, period. I never book a hotel. I never look at the work of another photographer from that area. And I never, ever, ever buy a guidebook to see the must-see sites. I don't want to see the must-see sites. And why not? Because those have been photographed 1 billion times by 1 million other people. I always chuckle when I go to Death Valley, and every morning, dozens, if not close to 100 photographers are all lined up, waiting for the light to hit Manly Beacon so they can take the same shot as everyone else, because it was in the guidebook. When right behind them is this image that probably none will ever see because it wasn't featured in that same guidebook. Ukrainians with eyes shut. few years ago, my son was serving in the Peace Corps in Ukraine, and my wife and I went off to visit him. And as is my practice, I made no preparations. I just went hoping I would see something that would inspire me, something that would excite me, and I would come home with a project. Well, I was in about 3 days and I haven't seen anything. And I'm starting to get a little worried because the clock is ticking and I'm counting down days remaining. The people are always interesting. But the problem I have with photographing people is that they always put on a camera face, that big smile, which is a mask, and it only shows you what they want to reveal. And as I pondered this problem, I was at a bus stop and I saw this old guy leaning against a wall. And I approached him and I tapped my chest and I said, "America." He nodded. I held up my camera and I said, "Photographer." He nodded. I then did the universal symbol for, "Can I take your picture?" He nodded and I took his picture. Then I said with sign language, "Stop, close your eyes." And he scrunched his face up as if to say, "What?" And I said it again, "Close your eyes." And I took his picture a second time and I loved it. Not only did it get rid of the camera face, it made me feel like I was seeing the real person. The mask was off. So for the next 2 weeks, I just walked around the streets of Ukraine and using sign language, I photographed people with their eyes shut. Now, this project never had great meaning back in 2008 when I created it, but all of a sudden in the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, it now takes on new meaning and new significance. I made a lot of friends there in Ukraine, people whom I still communicate with today. This is Natasha. She was my son's supervisor in Ukraine. She lives in Berislav in the Kherson Oblast, which is now under Soviet control. She refuses to leave because she has animals and won't leave them behind. And she texts us telling us that they're in the city, tanks are on the streets. She's afraid to go out to look for bread. She said they are setting mines and tripwires in the city. This is Serge, and I talk with him almost daily. I met him in the streets of Lviv, and Serge has got all of his family out, but he won't leave because his 87-year-old mother cannot travel. So he's there taking care of her. And now, he fears that the bombing and the missiles will start striking Lviv. I had an experience in Lviv that really opened my eyes. I was photographing on the streets when this little old man came shuffling up and asked what we were doing in very broken English. And we explained and he shuffled away. A few minutes later, he came shuffling back with a camera in hand. And he said, "Can I take your picture?" And I said, "Sure." And he said, "With your eyes closed." And he took my picture and sent it to me. And at that moment, I realized how vulnerable you feel when a stranger asks you on a busy street to shut your eyes. You're thinking, is this a joke? Is it a trick? Are my possessions safe? So I realized how trusting the people were to allow me to do that. I'm not sure I could pull that off, say in New York City or Chicago or Los Angeles. Do you dance? I heard this story told on the radio by an emergency room physician. He was working on the Navajo Indian reservation one Saturday when an old man came in with long gray braided hair. And the old man just stood and stared off into the distance. The physician grabbed his clipboard, went up to the old man and said, "Can I help you?" And the old man said nothing. He just kept staring. And the physician, just a little perturbed, said, "Look, I can't help you if you won't talk to me." And the old man turned and looked at him and said, "Do you dance?" And this caught the physician off guard, and he pondered that for a moment. And he wondered if maybe this wasn't a medicine man who believed in healing through song and dance. And so he said, "No, I don't. Can you teach me?" And the old man said, "I can teach you to dance, but you're the one who must hear the music." And I thought about that for two reasons. The first, a few years ago, my wife said, "We're going to start going out dancing," and I've signed us up for dance lessons. And it turns out that how I learned to dance was way different than how my wife learned. I learned to dance by memorizing the dance steps. I would count out loud is I stared off into the distance, and I'd go 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And as you can imagine, I was rather stiff and stilted. My wife learned vastly differently. She closed her eyes and she would listen to the music and she would flow with the music. And you can imagine the contrast between our two styles. Well, I remember the first time we went out dancing, she whispered into my ear and said, "Are you going to count out loud all night?" I had learned to dance by memorizing, but I didn't hear the music. And it reminds me of we as photographers. We sometimes learn photography with the technology, with our minds. We love it. The cameras, the lenses, the gear, all the computer stuff. It's fun, but you must hear the music. Harbinger. My son, Jim, son number 4, and I were out on a father and son outing on a hot July day. We were in eastern Utah, and we were driving along I-70, and I saw these great mud hills off to the north, right near the border of Colorado and Utah. And I said to my son, "We're going to stop and I'm going to photograph." And he immediately began to complain and moan and groan. And he said, "Can I just stay in the truck and watch a movie?" I said, "No, Jim, it's way too hot. You need to come with me." So up the hills we march. And I love these hills because they were these mud hills with not a single blade of grass or anything living on them. And I'm photographing, and it was interesting, but my son was complaining the entire time. "Can we go now? How much longer? You said 10 minutes ago." And I was not having any great success. The image was lacking something. And so finally I just said, let's go back to the truck. And as we got back to the truck, I just looked over my shoulder at those mud hills and I saw a single white cloud on the top of those hills moving quickly. And I could see that it would soon be over the 2 mud hills I had been photographing. So I yelled to Jim, "We're going back." We ran back up the hill, got the tripod out, got it set up, and got one shot. And I always name my images the first words that come to mind. And I named it Harbinger, which means an omen of things to come. And I love that image. And people would ask me, "Are you going to do a portfolio on it?" And I'd just chuckle thinking, what are the chances I'm going to see single clouds over interesting terrain? But the more I've looked and the more I've become aware, the more often I see them. And now I have a portfolio of these harbingers. That's Mount Whitney. This is over Tongariki and Easter Island, and over a butte in Arizona. And then I'd lay in this field for 2 hours trying to get that cloud to center itself over that windmill, but it wouldn't. And it was there that I learned that there are clouds that move quickly across the sky, like my first harbinger. But then there are little clouds like this fellow who stay in the same place and they dissipate and reform, but always in the same place. And I'm glad he didn't center himself. I think I like him better there. This is my favorite portfolio. Now, how important is equipment when creating an image? Well, not nearly as important as we think, and certainly not nearly as important as your vision. A story. A famous photographer was invited to dinner by a wealthy New York socialite. She greeted him warmly at the door and said, "I love your work. You must have a fabulous camera." He said nothing. At the end of the meal, he thanked her profusely and said, "That was a delicious meal. You must have a great stove." Now, none of us believe for a moment that a great stove makes a great meal. Yet sometimes we as photographers act as though our equipment is the key to a great image. If only I had this camera or that sensor or this lens or this gadget. If I had to choose between the world's best equipment, but I couldn't have my vision, or a Kodak Brownie with my vision, I'll take the Brownie. I was in St. Petersburg, Russia, photographing at the Winter Palace, spent all afternoon photographing this row of trees. And when I got home, they didn't turn out and I couldn't complete the image. And I was disappointed. But then I remembered that I had taken a single iPhone image. I always take one to share with family back home on Facebook. And I found that image, an 8 megapixel tiny sensor image, cropped it, worked it, and created this image. Equipment is not nearly as important as we think. Moi standing. When I was 17, I read all the adventure books by Thor Heyerdahl. I hope some of you have read them. He was a wonderful adventurer. And of all of his adventures, Aku Aku was my favorite, where he went to Easter Island and he tried to learn the secret of Easter Island. Do you remember what it was? It was, how did they move those stone giants 15 miles across the island? Well, my wife and I were creating our bucket list, and I just happened to mention out loud, I said, I'd love to go to Easter Island, but of course that's impossible. And my wife said to me, why? Why is that impossible? So off we went. While there, I created 3 portfolios, and this is the first, called Moi Standing. There are over 1,000 moi on Easter Island, but today only about 30 still stand. And they stand on these sacred altars, or ahus, very sacred to the Rapa Nui. You don't get close to them. And so it's a very small portfolio of this standing moi. Now, to give you a sense of scale, this is Tongariki, the largest ahu. This has got the tallest moi on Easter Island. He's about 35 foot tall. Would have been quite a few feet taller with his top knot, but it's been lost. And to give a sense of scale, that's a horse standing next to him. Now, whenever I go to a new place, I always get to know the dogs. I'm an animal lover, and I believe that by getting to know the dogs, it teaches me something about the people. For example, if you go to Moscow, you would never pet a stray dog because you will probably be bit and you will be getting rabies shots. That happened to my son, number 2. But in Easter Island, all the dogs are strays, and they're all incredibly gentle, docile, loving animals. And what they do is they hang out at the ahus, and they wait for tourists, and they beg for food. And we fell in love with this old guy. We named him Graybeard, and we would go by twice a day, every day for 2 weeks, just to feed and water him. Cole's rule of thirds. I was exhibiting a body of work in Boulder, Colorado. It was opening night, and I was entertaining guests. And I was standing there near my images when a woman came up and stood next to me and said, you know, that image doesn't follow the rule of thirds. And then she said, in this image, you should never put your horizon on the center line. And I looked at her, astounded because she couldn't see my images. She could only see rules not followed. And so, sort of in jest, I created Cole's rule of thirds, which states, a great image consists of 1/3 vision, 1/3 the shot, and 1/3 processing. But it's the vision that comes first, and it drives the shot, and it drives the processing. For many, many years, I only focused on the shot and the processing, and I was out of balance. And what I created was technically perfect, but soulless snapshots. Ironically, my favorite quote on vision comes from Helen Keller. She said, it's a terrible thing to see and have no vision. The lone man. I'm from Southern California, and I spent a great deal of time down in San Diego, and particularly at La Jolla Cove. It's my favorite spot. And I was one day photographing at the children's pool. It's just a stone jetty they built to protect the children from the waves. And I wanted to do a long exposure to show the motion of the water against the stillness of the jetty. But there were a lot of tourists. They love to go out to the end and look, and then a new group comes through. And I was waiting for everyone to clear out so I could get the shot. But there was a never-ending supply of tourists, and finally, out of frustration, I just went ahead and took my long exposure. And when I looked at it at the back of the camera, I was surprised to see that most all the people disappeared because they were in motion, except for this one person who stood still, perfectly still, for the entire 30 seconds. And then I realized I had seen this happen before. When people stand on the edge of the earth and they look off into the great expanse, they feel very, very small and insignificant. And they become very still and pensive, asking questions greater than self. Why am I here? Do I make a difference? What is my purpose in life? And I call that moment when they're alone with their thoughts, the lone man. And people will ask me, did you stage this? How did you get people to stand still for 30 seconds? And I'll tell them, no, these people don't even know they're being photographed. This is a recent one added from Death Valley. And my favorite from the Faroe Islands, that little speck up there is actually my daughter-in-law. And I was just so nervous because she's up there with my son and their child on his back. And every year, the Faroe Islands is a rather dangerous place. And every year, several tourists do fall to their death. A lot of my friends love to engage in these deep and esoteric discussions on subjects such as what is art and what is fine art, my favorite. And I just wanted to weigh in with my thoughts on this subject. Who cares? I only ask myself two questions. Do I like it? And would it look good on my wall? A few years ago, I had a high school senior call me up and she said, would you take my senior portrait? And I was about to respond that I'm really not that type of photographer. But then she said something that piqued my interest. She said, I'd like to do something unusual, something that no one else has ever done. And so we created this image called Ingrid Surrounded. And I remember one of my friends who got an MFA in photography saw this image and he said to me, well, you know, Cole, that really isn't a fine art image. And I said, Russ, I never said that it was, but pray tell, why not? I thought maybe there was a cow rule I was unaware of. And he said, because everyone knows that in a fine art image, the subject never smiles. And I thought, how ridiculous. How silly. I say create what you love, no matter what it's called or what other people think. Sometimes others don't understand or even like my work, and that's okay because I don't create it for them. At least I shouldn't. Power lines. And now here's an embarrassing story of a project that I never pursued for 18 years because I didn't think it was an appropriate fine art project. Power lines. I created my first power line image 18 years ago in San Francisco. I love the image, but I just didn't think it was an appropriate subject. I created my next one in Minneapolis about 5 years ago. And then here just recently, I just decided, you know what? I just love these power lines. They're so fascinating, so varied. And the great thing about them is they're everywhere. I don't have to go to Iceland or Easter Island to photograph them. They're here. So I've been actively pursuing this project. And during the worst of COVID, I went out into New Mexico where I'd be around no people and created this new power line image. And no one has ever guessed what this is. It's actually a long exposure of the smoke coming out of a power plant just over the hill. And it took me probably 100 shots to get that smoke exactly the way I want it. So how do I pick a subject for a portfolio? Well, the truth is I don't. It picks me. Every time I've created a new project, it's come from a moment of inspiration, something that got me excited and I had a passion for. I'd like to tell you about one such project called ceiling lamps. I was in a hotel lobby in Akron, Ohio, waiting to check out when I just noticed this lamp up on the ceiling. And I don't know why, but at that day, at that moment, it fascinated me. So I pushed the table out of the lobby. I lay on the floor and looked at that lamp. Then I got my camera out and started photographing it. And from straight below, I loved how it looked. That's my very first one. And then I started doing this everywhere I went. And most people would never even know these were ceiling lamps if I didn't tell them, because they weren't shot from the side, but from straight below. I just had a blast going everywhere looking for new shapes. And then I started combining them in different ways. and just had a lot of fun with the project. And then I was able to go to Moscow, and in their subway, they had these great Soviet era ceiling lamps I added to the collection. And one of the most important ingredients besides vision to a project is passion, having fun with it, loving it. Now, a lot of people have asked me, why do I create? I don't do it for a living. I don't do it for the money. But why do I do it? I thought about that 14-year-old boy and why he created. Just to please myself, to create images that I loved. But then I quickly learned that I could use it for positive feedback. Back then it was a pat on the back. Today it's a like. Then I wanted to start winning contests because I argued that was proof it was a good image. If it didn't win, it couldn't be a good image. Then I wanted to build a resume. I said, who will ever accept me as a serious photographer if I don't have an extensive resume? Then I wanted to be famous, the next Ansel Adams, and I went through my money-making phase. And now, some 50 years later, I find myself coming full circle and once again creating for the same reason as that 14-year-old boy, to simply please myself. I've learned that I do my best work when I create for myself. Linda Ronstadt said, I mean, it's nice to be acknowledged, nice for your work to be acknowledged, but it's not what you do it for. You do it for the work. And if you're doing it for the prizes, you're in big trouble. The Dunes of Nude. Every January, I spend most of the month in Death Valley. Why January? Well, the obvious reason, the temperatures are between 65 and 70 degrees, and the crowds are gone. The high season, believe it or not, is July and August. So I can travel around Death Valley with very few people. And the thing I do the most is go to the dunes. I go there every morning and every evening when the sun is low, the contrast is high, and the shadows are ever so long. And it just creates a look that I love. You know, I've been going to Death Valley ever since 1969. And I always see something new because, again, my vision is always changing as I change. Now, what photographic rules should you follow? None, unless you want to create average images that look just like everyone else's who are following the same rules. You remember paint by number? We were promised that if we followed the rules, basically stay within the numbers, we could create a masterpiece. Maybe not a masterpiece. You don't create a masterpiece by following the numbers or by following the rules. At best, all you'll produce is a crude imitation. Ansel Adams said, the so-called rules of composition are, in my opinion, invalid, irrelevant, immaterial. And an ex-Ansel Adams imitator stated, there are no need for rules when you have found your vision. Lenny, a portrait of breast cancer. Lenny was a customer of mine. She bought the Angel Gabriel from me. And about a year later, I got a call from Lenny who said, I've got breast cancer. I've had a mastectomy, and I want you to photograph me. And I said, Lenny, I am so sorry to hear that. But Lenny, I don't really do that type of work. And she said, I don't care. I want you to do it. I said, Lenny, I don't have the portrait skills. I don't have lighting equipment. I've got nothing. It'll be fine. I want you to do it. Lenny, let me give you the name of a woman I know who specializes in this type of work. No, I want you to do it. So off I went to Grand Junction, Colorado to photograph Lenny. And I found her to be beautiful and dignified, but it was an uncomfortable subject. Uncomfortable for me, and I couldn't imagine how so for Lenny. But she was insistent that other women needed to see these images. And so, of course, I created this portfolio in black and white, but I had a vision of how I wanted to portray her. And as we photographed, I wanted to ask Lenny a question, but I was afraid to. I was afraid to ask it to hear what the answer might be, but I was also worried it would ruin the mood of the shoot. And so finally, near the end of the shoot, I summoned up enough courage to ask Lenny my question. Lenny, what is your prognosis? This is in July of 2008. She said, I'll be dead by Christmas. The good news is some 14 years later, Lenny is still with us. She got into an experimental treatment program in Texas and it worked. And I am so grateful that Lenny was insistent and made me do this project. Sometimes hard things bring about good things. I don't know if you have ever experienced this, but people are always telling me what I should do with my images. Yeah, they're polite enough. They'll say, if this were my image, here's what I would do. And I say, don't follow other people's advice, not about your vision. When I created the Angel Gabriel, I was so excited because it was the first time I had visualized it and actually executed it. And so I showed it to my mentor at the time. And the first words out of her mouth were, don't center the subject. Cole, I'm always telling you this. Don't center the subject. I was in a quandary. My vision said one thing, and my expert mentor said another. So I went home and tried cropping it differently. I hated it. I hate it today. She may have seen it this way. She may have done it this way, but it was my image, my vision. And there are no experts when it comes to your vision. Another story. A new photographer was exhibiting his work for the very first time. In attendance was a well-known art critic. He approached the photographer and said, would you like to hear my opinion about your work? Sure, said the photographer, let's hear it. It's worthless, said the art critic. I know, said the photographer, but let's hear it anyway. You are the only expert when it comes to your vision. And don't ask others what you should do with your images. People write me all the time and they'll send me an image and say, what should I do with this image? And I'll tell them, look, if I told you what I would do and you followed my advice and you kept following my advice, soon your images would begin to look like mine. And believe me, you don't want that. Confucius say, they who walk in another's footsteps never finds their own path. Moy, sitting for portrait. This is the third portfolio from my Easter Island trip. Getting to Easter Island is not easy. It's not for the faint of wallet. You go from Denver to Toronto to Santiago and out to Easter Island. They call it the most isolated inhabited place on earth. On that long leg, I fell asleep and had a dream. I dreamt that the Moy were actually alive, and I had brought 2 stands and a giant roll of paper and set up an outdoor studio. Then I went from Moy to Moy, inviting them to come and sit for a portrait. What I hadn't appreciated was the Moy had been so poorly treated by outsiders in the past that they were reluctant. Some just said no. Others said they were too old or too infirm to make the journey. And often they said they didn't want to run into other clan members whom they had a dispute with. So after issuing the invitations, I really wasn't sure if anyone would show up. Well, the day and hour came and no one did show up at first. But soon some of the younger Moy began to trickle in and I took their portrait. And as word got out, more and more of the Moy came to sit for a portrait. Well, I woke up from that dream, told my wife about it, and then pondered it for a bit and said to her, you know what? I'm going to do it. I'm going to invite the Moy to come sit for a portrait. And I did invite them. And they did come. Now, of course, the Moy didn't come to me, but I went to them. I would photograph them under cloud cover. Then I would outline them and place them on a digital backdrop that I had created. Now, the reason I did that was I wanted to be able to dodge up highlights to make it look like they sat under studio lighting, trying to recreate a studio look. Now, remember, I've got no experience with portraits and zero with lighting, but I can learn anything. I had a fun time with this project because the Moi really were delightful beings. Vision blockers. I mentioned earlier that the most important truth I learned about vision is that we all have one. You can't not have one. I believe we all are born with incredible creativity and vision. But unfortunately, over time, sometimes that's trained out of us. As I look back at my images at age 14 through 17, I really do, as I look back now, think that I had some creative ability and some vision. But what happened was I put on these vision blockers. They're like these glasses. Do you guys remember blue blockers? They used to sell them because they would block the blue out for the bright sunlight. Well, vision blockers are like those, except for they block out the vision. And every time I listened to other people, my vision blockers got a little darker. Whenever I cared what others thought of my work and I created for them, they got darker still. When I conformed or followed the rules, when I tried to earn likes or win contests, they got darker and darker. When I tried to please others, they got so dark that I finally lost my vision. In fact, over the years, I didn't even believe I ever had one. To find my vision again, I had to learn to let go of my vision blockers. And once I did that, my vision was able to emerge again. And I became free to create whatever I wanted, however I wanted. The Faroe Islands. I was watching the BBC show Shetland. Loved the show, but what I loved more than the show was the scenery behind them. I just fell in love with the coastline of the Shetlands. And so I decided off I would go. But I didn't know where they were at. So I get on Google Maps and became distracted with the Faroe Islands. 17 little islands out in the absolute middle of nowhere. So off I went for a month. The Faroe Islands is my favorite place on earth. They are rugged. They are incredibly beautiful. They are incredibly colorful if you're a color photographer. And the weather is ever changing. If it was bad in one spot, I would just go to a different island. And at times you felt like you were in the 1700s because the homes, even in the cities, have sod roofs and these old stone walls keeping sheep with sheep herders in them. But then you'd go through these undersea tunnels connecting the two islands, modern undersea tunnels, the only undersea roundabout in the world. And you felt like you were in the 21st century. Every day I would come out of the tunnel and I would see this shot. And I would photograph that several times a day until I finally got this one image. It is really a spectacular place. And I'd say go there before it turns into an Iceland. So how long do projects take? Well, the truth is they just take as long as they take. There is no rule. I've talked about projects, a couple I've worked on for over 20 years. It took me 9 months to do the grain silo project. It took me 12 hours to do the trees from a train project. Now I'd like to show you a project I completed in an hour and 45 minutes. The Ghost of Auschwitz-Birkenau. When I was visiting my son in Ukraine, we had a couple of extra days, so we decided to take the train over to Poland. We stayed in Krakow at the city square. And as we were discussing what we wanted to do with our free time, and I was hoping they wouldn't want to go to the death camps, to Auschwitz-Birkenau. I don't like sad stories. I won't watch a sad movie. And I sure didn't want to go to a place described as a death camp. But the family outvoted me and off we went. We took a tour. And as we were driving over on the bus, I was thinking about where we were going. And I thought, if there is a sacred place on earth, it's got to be Auschwitz-Birkenau. And so I decided I would not photograph there. I thought it would be sacrilegious or maybe just disrespectful. So as we got off the bus, I asked the driver if I could leave my gear on board. And he said no, he would not be responsible. So fortunately, I had my gear with me as we began the tour. You start the tour by being shown this book that documents every single person there. On the left, an incredibly well done black and white photograph. And as I looked at that photograph, it was clear to me that the photographer was very skilled and took pride in his work. And on the right, a description about everything about the person. And in the first 5 minutes of the tour, my head starts to spin. Why are they so carefully documenting someone that they will either work to death or outright murder? Then they took us into the room with the iconic piles. We've all seen pictures of them. The pile of glasses, the pile of human hair used to stuff mattresses and pillows, and the one that really got to me, the pile of human bridge work yanked from the mouths of the dead. And I'm not claustrophobic, but I just couldn't breathe. I couldn't stay in that room. And I signaled to my family that they should continue the tour. I was going outside. And once outside, I just walked slowly, looking at my feet, trying to gain my breath. And then I started thinking about my feet and where I walked. And I thought, who else walked in these same footsteps? Who else took the same path as I on their way to the gas chamber? And then I wondered, metaphorically, I wonder if the spirits of those people who lived and died at Auschwitz-Birkenau, if their spirits remained. And then this thought just entered my head. I need to photograph their ghosts. And so I did. Using the other visitors at the camp and a long exposure, I created these ghosts. Now, I had two challenges. The first, every time I set up my tripod to do a long exposure, the people would clear out of the way, not wanting to interfere with the image. And they didn't understand I needed them to be in the image. So I had to quickly devise a technique. I would turn my back to the camera. I would speak loudly into my cell phone, playing the part of the loud American, and I would wait for them to meander back in. Then using a remote shutter release, I would get the shot. The other challenge, I only had 45 minutes left in Auschwitz, and then another hour at Birkenau. So I found myself running from location to location to document these things that I saw in my head. This is the only image that I included a living person. It had great meaning to me, but I never tell people what they should think of the image. And over the years, as I've asked people how they interpreted this, I've received probably a dozen different interpretations than my own. And the gas chamber with the ghosts escaping. Couldn't bring myself to go in, nor could I ever go back to a death camp. One of the blessings that this project has brought into my life is that I've met well over 100 Auschwitz survivors. I was exhibiting this work at the Dallas Holocaust Museum at their new gallery. It was opening night, and I saw this old woman being pushed around in a wheelchair. And as she got to each image, she would lean very far forward, and she would examine the images very, very closely. So I went up to her and I said, "Hi, my name is Cole, and these are my images." And I remember Edith raising this bony, crooked finger, and it was shaking. And she pointed at the images and said, "These are my images." Edith Molnar had been interned and survived Auschwitz-Birkenau. I couldn't fathom what she might be thinking or feeling. And then I was honored to speak on the 100th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau at the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles. And there I spoke to over 100 survivors. And we've all met survivors perchance. We've heard their stories, but it's another thing to be holding their hand as they tell you this incredible story of human cruelty and human survival. So, final tip for the evening. What's the easiest way to make money from fine art photography? You probably guessed it. Sell your equipment. There's not a lot of money in fine art photography, but that's not why I do it for. I do it because this is how I express myself. I'm not good at expressing feelings, but I am hopefully good at creating images that express feelings. Now, summary for tonight. Three-legged dogs are awesome, and so is black and white, if that's what your vision dictates. The real key is your vision. Forget the rules. Don't follow other people's advice, not about your vision. Let go of your vision blockers and listen to the music. Thank you. I'm going to stop my share now. And
Cole, I can't thank you enough for that presentation. That's, if not the best, it's among the best of the presentations that I've seen on here. So thank you so much.
you bet. Would love people to maybe unmute themselves and share your thoughts about anything I've talked about tonight, or ask a question if you have one.
I was touched by everything you talked about, and especially got me was the part about having your own vision. I think we lose ourselves without that, and I think that's going to help my photography here on out.
Yeah, I agree, Carol. I mean, we get so tied up into following rules or doing what the local expert says, or we read a magazine and learn about the things you should be doing or shouldn't be doing, and we lose sight of how we see an image.
I always said rules are made to be broken.
I say never learn them.
Got that right. That's all I ever heard was rules when I first started.
When you guys have a new member who comes into the club, never tell them about the rules.
I have one question for you.
Yes.
At the beginning, unless I misunderstood, do you use a monochrome setting within the camera?
Correct.
Okay. So when you're processing when the raw image goes to Lightroom or whichever, and you take it into Photoshop, it shows as a color image?
Yep. A lot of people don't know that. If you shoot in RAW, no matter what you change on your camera, whether it be sharpness or saturation or anything, the raw image ignores that setting. A raw image is a plain vanilla image. It cannot be affected by any of those changes you make to your camera settings. So the beauty is you get both the ability to see in black and white on the back of your camera, but you get a color image when you bring it into Photoshop. So it's the best of both worlds, especially if you're a person who likes to do both black and white and color.
That is awesome. Never knew that. Thank you.
Now, what is it you're not supposed to do when shooting in monochrome? You remember?
JPEG.
Not shoot in JPEG, because it'll record the image in black and white. In JPEG, any of those changes you make to your camera will be recorded in the JPEG image. That's why RAW is such a delight to use. Other questions or thoughts before I do one final thing before saying goodnight?
Well,
Okay.
I want to say, I heard you a couple of years ago, and it sort of shook up my world. And so this quest for vision, it's ongoing. It's forever. I don't think it's a destination I'll ever find, but it's really fun to just go out and interact with the world. I really like what you say about trying to think of ourselves as artists first, who happen to use photography, because I think that really changes the paradigm or the headset. So I thank you, because as one person who's seen you twice, and this was great. I mean, I love your work, and I like your inspiration. Most of all, I like your message. So thank you.
Thanks, Jim. If you're interested on how I went about to find my vision, I have an article on my website called How I Found My Vision. It's under the blog section, and it goes into detail about the 10 steps that I took And again, it was an excruciating experience, and no one can help you with it. It's like a solitary journey, and it's hard because you got to do a lot of soul searching and ask some really honest questions. So I always give away a copy of the Angel Gabriel, a print, at the end of my presentation. And so how I do this is I look for someone who's got the closest birthday to today. So does anybody have a birthday within the last week or the next upcoming week? How about the last month or the upcoming month?
February 11th.
February 11th. So that is roughly 35 days. Can anybody beat 35 days?
April 21st.
And how is that? April 21st. This is the 17th. So that would be, oh my gosh, it's got to be close to a tie. Can someone do the math for me? I'm so bad. 17th to the 17th, and there's 31 days. So that's 31 days. And then you said the 25th?
21st.
21st. Oh, that's, boy, is that a tie or is that, that looks like 24 days to me. Someone help me out here.
That's 37 days.
Oh, 37 days. 37 days. And
This is our treasurer.
February, Chris, what was your birthday again?
February 11th.
February 11th. How many days is that, Carol? Help me.
34, I think.
Ooh,
35.
34. 35. Okay, I think Chris has got it unless somebody else wants to speak up. Chris, you're a winner of the print of the Angel Gabriel.
Oh, thank you. It's the first thing I've ever won.
Maybe you better go buy a lottery ticket tonight. If you would email me with your address, I'll get a printout to you. Now I'm heading out for 10 days, so I'll do it when I return.
Okay, have a good trip.
Okay, thank you all. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank
Jim,
you.
thanks for inviting me. Thank you, Jenny, for all your help in coordinating this.
Thanks
Okay,
very
great.
much.
Good night, all.
Thank you.
Good
Good
luck on the
night.
rest of your meeting.
Good night.